just the beginning. Puerto Rico defaults on a major debt, signaling more to come. Down to the wire, Indiana's GOP primary could be close. Cold War thawing. The first U.S. cruise ship in decades arrives in Havana. And Orthodox Christians celebrate Easter. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Monday, May 2nd, 2016. Good evening from Washington. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick. Puerto Rico defaults on a multi-million-dollar debt payment due to the U.S. government today. It is not the first time and likely not the last. Lauren Ashburn has White House and Capitol Hill reaction tonight. Lauren?
Brian, in Washington, it's been a swirling, simmering controversy without a solution. Congress can't agree on a rescue plan. On top of the default, its tax base is diminishing. Some 1,500 islanders leave every week. Now the tropical U.S. territory could go belly up. Many know Puerto Rico for its stunning beaches, colonial architecture. Founded by Christopher Columbus in 1493, Spain ceded the country to the U.S. in 1898 after its defeat in the Spanish-American War. But this weekend, the governor of the U.S. territory admitted defeat, saying funding services like police and fire for the 3.5 million American citizens in Puerto Rico had to come first. According to the U.S. Department of Treasury, 45% of islanders live in poverty compared to the national average of 16%. The average salary, $19,000. There's been a long-standing debate in Congress over how to help the territory. But what has taken so long? Press Secretary Josh Earnest says it's Congress's inability to act, a charge Republicans dismiss.
We haven't seen the kind of movement in the Republican-led Congress that we need to see to make a bailout of Puerto Rico less likely.
The goal here is to bring order to the chaos. It is to give oversight board the kind of authority they need to make sure that they get their fiscal house in order, to restructure the debt, and to make sure that taxpayers are not involved in this. Those objectives will be achieved based on what I know where these negotiations are going.
So what's the next step? Republicans oppose a bailout without concessions on pensions. Democrats are pressing for greater protections for unions. There is consensus that a financial control board is needed to veto spending. Similar boards have been created over the years for American cities, including Washington, D.C., New York, and Detroit. Brian?
Thank you, Lauren Ashburn at the White House. Other stories our EWTN News Nightly team is covering in today's world. Candidates crisscross Indiana ahead of tomorrow's primary there. Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton reaffirms her defense of Planned Parenthood and abortion on demand. Clinton attacks an Indiana law signed by Governor Mike Pence banning abortion sought for genetic defects. She calls the law an assault on women. Bernie Sanders is telling his supporters he needs to win more than half of the remaining delegates to have a shot at the Democratic nomination. He acknowledges he faces an uphill battle. Meanwhile, Republican Ted Cruz says he's still in the running with Donald Trump.
It's going to be up to the people of Indiana. The polls have been all over the place. There's literally been a 30-point swing depending on which poll you're looking at. We are neck and neck right now in the state of Indiana.
Cruz campaigned today with Governor Mike Pence by his side. Detroit teachers call in sick today, closing all but 3 of the city's public schools. They're protesting funding issues at the financially struggling district, which enrolls about 46,000 students. The district says it can't continue paying teachers this summer or funding summer school or special ed programs. Michigan lawmakers are considering a restructuring plan to try to pay off the district's enormous debt. A new study finds religious liberty around the world is under serious and sustained assault. It shows the situation has gotten worse within the past year. Wyatt Goolsby is here with more tonight. Wyatt?
Brian, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom finds violations in more than 30 countries, from Europe to Asia and the Middle East. People are suffering simply because of their faith.
Around the world, there's no shortage of religious persecution, from terrorist groups like ISIS and Boko Haram to state governments like China cracking down on worshipers. It's all laid out in the Commission's 2016 annual report, which paints a grim picture.
Unfortunately, we can find no place in the world where the situation for religious freedom and persecuted people has gotten better. There are some places where it's gotten worse, or perhaps I should say even worse.
Dr. Robert George says his commission recommends the U.S. add 7 more countries to monitor: the Central African Republic, Egypt, Iraq, Nigeria, Pakistan, Syria, and Vietnam. Violations vary from intolerant laws to a rise in violence against religious minorities. Even in less violent parts of the world, like Europe, the report cites acts of bigotry against Jews and Muslims. Dr. George says the U.S. must redouble its efforts to defend religious liberty around the world. He says it's vital.
We cannot simply withdraw behind two oceans and imagine that we will be unaffected by pressures against religious freedom in foreign nations. And the other thing is, of course, we can't actually be ourselves, true to our own values, if we stand by idly, doing business as usual with regimes that are systematic persecutors of people of faith.
This report says the genocide of Christians and other religious minorities by ISIS is the main problem in the Middle East. It points out the governments there have not been able to protect their own citizens from persecution. It has laid out the humanitarian crisis in Europe. Brian.
Wyatt Goolsby, thank you. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry says intense work is underway to salvage a ceasefire in Syria. The focus is on the northern city of Aleppo, where a hospital was hit by an airstrike last week.
The attack on this hospital is unconscionable under any standard, anywhere.
The U.S. and Russia have agreed to increase the staff at UN headquarters in Geneva to help enforce the ceasefire. Hundreds of civilians have been killed in Aleppo this past week alone. Pope Francis speaks out about the violence amid the already desperate humanitarian situation in Syria. He singles out Aleppo. Mary Shovlain has more from Rome.
Brian, during his traditional Sunday remarks in St. Peter's Square, the Pope lamented the spiral of violence that is affecting children and the sick in Aleppo. He's pleading with all sides involved to respect the ceasefire and to pursue dialogue. He was referring to the attacks last week on a hospital in Aleppo that killed over 50 people, including medical personnel. Pope Francis said he is deeply saddened by the spiral of violence that is claiming innocent victims. The Holy Father also mentioned pedophilia during the Regina Coeli address to an organization who works tirelessly to support and protect abuse victims. He encouraged them in their work, and he said anyone who abuses children should be severely punished. He said it's the work of all of us to protect them. In Rome, Mary Shovlain, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Mary. Fire destroys a historic Orthodox church in New York City just hours after Easter celebrations there. It broke out Sunday evening in Manhattan's Serbian Orthodox Cathedral of St. Sava. Firefighters say the building was completely gutted, its roof destroyed. The Gothic Revival-style cathedral was built in the early 1850s. It was designated a city landmark in 1968. A member of council is calling for a full investigation into the cause of that fire on Sunday. The first American cruise ship in nearly 40 years docks in Havana today after crossing the Florida Straits from Miami. Catherine Zeltner reports.
Cuban flags wave as Carnival Cruise Line's Adonia pulls into Havana. Hundreds of workers and passerbys gather to watch the 704-passenger ship make its way through the Cuban waters. One woman says she's cheering because she has family on the cruise ship, and she wants Cuba and the U.S. to be united. Commercial travel is a major part of the Obama administration's efforts to establish diplomatic relations with Cuba.
To be a part of truly making history and preparing for an even more positive future for everyone is one of the greatest honors any company can have.
Cuba's government changed a policy last month, giving Cuban Americans a chance to visit their homeland.
We do have Cuban-born Americans.
Tourists see the cruise as a unique opportunity.
I think it's great bringing the countries together.
There's a lot of controversy. Some of my friends thought I was foolish, but something I wanted to always do.
The cruise ship will also visit 2 other Cuban ports during its 7-day outing. Catherine Zeltner, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Catherine. Frank Calzon is executive director of the Center for a Free Cuba. Are you celebrating this, Frank?
Not quite. While 12 Cubans managed to get on that ship, there are hundreds of Cubans fleeing Castro, waiting for passage in Central America as refugees.
So there's still refugees trying to cross the straits on rafts. Why are there so many if things are improving between the U.S. and Cuba and supposedly for the Cuban people?
because things might be improving as far as the so-called legacy of President Obama, but they're not improving as far as the Cuban people. There has been an increasing repression. Raul Castro offered a couple of years ago that every Cuban was going to have a glass of milk. We're still waiting for that. In the recent Congress of Cuban Communist Party, that some people on this side were hoping to see some moderation, Raul Castro was elected unanimously again for 5 more years as Secretary General of the party. So while he's been talking to Mr. Obama about retiring in 2 years, he'll stay like Stalin was for 5 more years as head of the Cuban Communist Party. That's where the real power rests in Cuba.
Can the U.S. put any pressure on Cuba, on Castro, to make some kind of a democratic change?
The president could, but has not, put pressure at least to stop some of the most outrageous human rights violations. While the president was in Cuba, Cuban women, mothers, wives, daughters of political prisoners were beat up or dragged down the street. It is unconscionable that the President of the United States did not say to Raul Castro, this has to stop.
What do you hear from Cuban Catholics, Frank?
Cuban Catholics are happy now that Cardinal Ortega finally retired. In the views of many of us, the Cardinal meant well, but he was too involved in politics. I think we now are going to have an archbishop from Camagüey who is more interested in religion and helping the poor. That's our kind of religious leader in Cuba.
Well, that's a positive change. Frank Calzon, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Malia Obama will attend Harvard after taking a year off from school. The White House confirms that President Obama's elder daughter will begin her term at Harvard in 2017. She is now a senior at an exclusive D.C. high school. Malia follows in her parents' footsteps. Both have Harvard law degrees. Coming up, at a time of deep political division, one issue brings the parties together. We'll explain. And a Marine court-martialed for her display of faith takes her case to the military's highest court. On the 2nd of May, we celebrate St. Athanasius. The 4th century bishop and doctor of the church is known for defending the doctrine of Christ's divinity. Athanasius attended the Council of Nicaea. He was exiled at least 5 times. Thanks for joining us this Monday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. Well, after years of tough penalties for drug offenders, Republican and Democratic leaders worked together trying to reform criminal justice. Jason Calvi joining us tonight with the story.
Brian, federal law requires certain minimum sentences for certain drug crimes. A new bill would give judges the option to give lower sentences, but critics say it would allow for the release of serious, dangerous traffickers. I spoke to someone who was convicted for selling drugs. He says nonviolent offenders don't deserve to have their whole lives taken away.
It's about time.
Kevin Chapman was serving 6 life sentences. His offense? Selling less than $200 worth of meth.
You know, I had to be honest. I lost hope, but I still had my faith. You know, I leaned on my faith, and if I wasn't going to come home, I knew I had to get better.
In his 10 years in prison, he took classes including on anger management. California changed state mandatory minimums, and Chapman was released in 2013.
Mandatory minimum sentences were once seen as a strong deterrent, and we now know, sadly, they have filled the prisons with many people who are not a real danger.
In 1980, the federal prison population was less than 25,000. Today, it is close to 200,000. Former prosecutor and Republican Senator Mike Lee quotes a judge forced to give a minimum sentence.
It makes no sense, and yet my hands are tied. I must impose it because Congress has given me no choice.
So 3 years ago, this Republican and Democrat came together to make changes. Their goal is to reduce overcrowding in prisons, save taxpayer dollars, and give nonviolent offenders a second chance.
It does not entitle you to a get-out-of-jail-free card. All you get under this bill is a hearing.
Sponsors say the new proposal gives victims a say, and it won't apply to violent felons. If signed into law, thousands of inmates could follow in the footsteps of former drug dealer Kevin Chapman.
I wanted to be a productive person in society, and I knew I could be.
Chapman is now free. He has a job and supervises close to 30 employees.
Democratic Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois predicts the bill will pass the Senate with the majority of Republicans and the majority of Democrats voting for it. But Republican Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas is against it. He says it's a dangerous experiment in leniency, and victims of crime and police will deal with the costs. Brian?
Who else is backing the bill, Jason?
Well, it has 37 co-sponsors. The White House says it's one area where they can find common ground with the Republican-led Congress. In the fall, I met with faith leaders, including people from the U.S. Bishops' Conference, and they were also supporting criminal justice reform at that point.
When is it likely then to come to the Senate floor?
We're all waiting for Leader Mitch McConnell, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, but right now the schedule is so booked, and it's especially pressed now during this election year.
All right, Jason Calvi, thank you. Good report. Well, the FBI thwarts an attack on a Jewish center in Florida. James Medina appeared in a federal court today. He was arrested last week for an alleged plot against a Jewish synagogue, school, and meeting hall. The FBI says it learned in March that Medina, a Muslim convert, planned to bomb the center. He was arrested after accepting a fake bomb from an undercover operative on Friday. The highest military court considers whether religious freedom laws apply to members of the U.S. service. The Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces heard the case of Manifa Sterling last week. The Marine was court-martialed for refusing to remove a Bible verse posted at her workplace. She was convicted in a lower court, given a dishonorable discharge, then demoted to the lowest possible rank. Ken Klukowski is senior counsel for the First Liberty Institute, a legal group exclusively dedicated to religious freedom. A court-martial seems very extreme in this case. How did it come to that?
Well, in this case, and thanks for shining the spotlight on this, Brian, this is the kind of threat to religious liberty that most Americans don't even realize is happening in our own country as we look at abuses going on overseas. Where you had here a low-ranking Marine who noticed in her office space that in the other personal spaces of her coworkers, they had personal items. It might be a family photo. Some of them, though, had inspirational sayings or postings put up, like those posters that we see. And so as a Bible-believing Christian, she decided to try and inspire herself with some Bible quotes. And so she printed out one verse 3 times. No weapons formed against me shall prosper, a paraphrase of Isaiah 54:17, and just posted it on her computer monitors and in her personal workspace. She had a superior who told her to take those down. He never told anyone else to take down their other personal items, including other inspirational phrases. He just didn't like that one.
But here she refused, so that's insubordination.
Exactly. So she was court-martialed and then ultimately convicted.
So what oral arguments did you make in her defense, or the First Liberty?
Well, what was disturbing is the lower court in this case said that posting Bible verses was not a form of a religious exercise, and that because of it, it was not protected by an extremely important federal law, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. This is the law passed by Congress that protected Hobby Lobby at the U.S. Supreme Court, is currently protecting perhaps the Little Sisters of the Poor. Hopefully. At the Supreme Court, God willing. And they said that because she could not show how posting a Bible verse was an essential aspect of her religious faith, that somehow it was unprotected by RFRA. And so what was very dangerous about it was to think that RFRA requires you to point to a doctrinal statement showing that you're required to do something before you can claim religious liberty protection. And we teamed up with former U.S. Solicitor General Paul Clement, who's argued 83 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, who made those arguments as to why RFRA does protect people like Manifa Sterling as they try to exercise their faith.
An important religious freedom case. Ken Klukowski, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Up next, Orthodox Christians around the world celebrate their Easter Sunday. And a man being called Brazil's surfer saint is remembered 7 years after his drowning death. Pope Francis to receive 6,000 homeless pilgrims, a tweet from Vatican Media today. Vatican Radio reports Francis will host a jubilee for homeless people from all over Europe at the close of the Year of Mercy. Thanks for joining us this Monday, May 2nd. I'm Brian Patrick. Orthodox Christians around the world celebrate Easter this past Sunday. Bells at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre ring out in Jerusalem. Jerusalem's Greek Orthodox Patriarch Theophilus III leads a procession as worshipers gather in the church's courtyard. Easter Mass was celebrated inside the church, the site where we as Christians believe Jesus was crucified, was buried, and rose from the dead. Hundreds of Orthodox Christians in Syria attend Easter Mass at the Holy Cross Church in Damascus. Syrian Christians say they hope and pray for peace in their nation, especially for Syria's children. Advocates deliver a petition with more than 400,000 signatures to the United Nations on Friday. It asks the UN to declare the persecution of Christians and religious minorities in the Middle East genocide. The event was part of a 3-day International Religious Freedom Conference in New York. Jordan Allott just returned from the conference. He's a senior advisor to In Defense of Christians and founder of Altum Productions. How was your petition received at the UN, Jordan?
Well, I think it was received very well. It was really awe-inspiring to be there when this petition was delivered, especially coming on the cusp of the U.S. government and the European Parliament declaring what is happening to Christians and other minorities in Iraq and Syria as genocide.
You showed your documentary, Our Last Stand, at this conference. Just give us a snapshot of what this is about.
Sure, we had the opportunity to show segments of this new documentary, which we're just finishing up, and we've been able to show it as well at the European Parliament and other places. The documentary follows an Assyrian-American woman named Helma as she journeys back to her ancestral homeland in Iraq and Syria, actually where her parents are from, to help reveal to the world what is happening to Christians and others currently. There are a number of things about this production I think are a little bit unique, and one of them is trying to personalize what is happening through Helma, somebody who's very American but also very connected with her roots. And a lot of the people that we meet with also are very relatable, very likable, very inspiring, because oftentimes being halfway across the world, it can be difficult to relate to a very distant foreign problem like that.
We really need that personal connection. So you obviously spent time in Syria and Iraq. What did you witness personally?
Well, and that was another thing we wanted to do, is go beyond the refugee camps. We spent a lot of time at those camps to talk to those who are suffering, those who are trying to help them. But we wanted to meet with also sort of everyday Iraqis and Christians, Assyrian, Chaldean, Syriac Christians in both countries. And we actually even met with Helma's family members who she hasn't seen in a long time, many years, to talk to them about their situation, their fears, their goals. I mean, every day they have to make the decision, is this another day we're going to stay where our family has lived for thousands of years, or are we going to leave?
You also met with a priest in Iraq. Tell us about that meeting.
Father Douglas Bazzi, who a lot of people are starting to hear about. He has an unbelievable story about his own persecution and abduction by extremists when he was in another part of Iraq, near Baghdad. Now he's up in Erbil, and I told him, because he was at our conference this past week, I said, you often don't talk about the leadership that he has shown in taking in so many refugees to his parish church in Erbil. It's a story that needs to be told, because he's focusing on educating the young people. And as he says, Iraq has a lot of bosses, but not many leaders. So he's a leader, and he's creating more leaders. And I think there's some hope and some optimism that better days are ahead for Iraqis and for Syrians.
We were blessed to have Father Bazzi on EWTN News Nightly. Blessed to have you too, Jordan Allott, with In Defense of Christians and in Altum Productions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, finally tonight, surfers gather on a Brazilian beach, remembering a man known as the Surfer Angel, 7 years after his death. Friends and family of surfer Guido Schaefer gather for Mass Sunday on a beach in Rio de Janeiro. The 34-year-old drowned while surfing off the coast here just weeks before he was to be ordained a Catholic priest. Schaefer was also a doctor. He worked with Brazil's indigenous peoples and the country's poor before entering the seminary. Cardinal Arani Tempesta, Archbishop of Rio, has been involved in efforts to canonize Schaefer. The Cardinal says Guido shows anyone can aspire to sainthood when you open yourself up to the Holy Spirit and put yourself at the service of the poor. Guido's mom was also there.
Eu me sinto muito honrada.
She says she's honored and consoled by the Mass for her son. The Vatican gave the go-ahead for Schaefer's life and work to be studied. The beatification process, the first step in the path towards sainthood, started in January 2015. Guido's friends and followers hope he'll become Brazil's first surfer saint. On that note, until tomorrow, for the EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick. On this feast of St. Athanasius, good night. May God bless you.